Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. In this video, I'm going to ask what the arguments are against social justice. There's no other pithy phrase for it. Now, first of all, does it even exist? Well, I think most people would accept there's justice at a legal level, as in if you're found guilty of a crime, you should be awarded the appropriate punishment in relation to the severity of the offence. Let the punishment fit the crime, as Gilbert and Sullivan wrote. Things like that, or if you breach a contract, then consequences should flow, you should have to pay to put it right, things of that nature. But looking at society as a whole, when justice is not strictly individual, it's not about breaches of the criminal law as civil wrong. Well, some people would say, well, there isn't any, it should just be the law of the jungle. But should we care about people at all? Should we seek to relieve suffering at all? Again, not at an individual level, not just donating to charity, but do governments have any role in reducing suffering, in making sure people don't starve, in making sure people don't die of exposure and so on? Well, majority of people would accept that the government does have some role. There'll be some ultra-libertarians who don't. There'll be other people who are hyper-capitalists, who are not libertarians on other issues, but this would say, let them starve. Margaret Thatcher, she quoted St. Paul saying, those who do not work shall not eat, and so on. Although, of course, the chairborne classes don't need to work in order to eat, and they get to eat better than almost anybody else. So let's, for the sake of argument, assume that it does exist. Of course, you could have a more aggressive version of it, saying that actually the working class have too much, the affluent should have more, and that's rarely true. So when I'm talking about social justice, well, I have a more limited view of what it ought to be than many. I'm a right-winger. But social justice would include things like workers' rights. Which particular work rights? Well, the right to form a trade union, to collective bargaining. If your contract is there, then it's got to be obeyed by both sides. You go back to the 19th century in the United Kingdom, it was the breach of contract by the employer, was always called a master then, was a civil wrong, whereas breach by the employee or servant the person was always called, even if it was at a company, servant in the legal terminology. That was criminous. But so there was an inequality there, but that's been rectified. But some degree of job security, that they can't just sack you on a whim if you've done nothing wrong after a certain period. There ought to be some probation period of 3 months, 6 months, a year, or whatever it is. Usually do require some more rights. If you work there for decades, blamelessly, can't be just got rid of. Now, if the company's laying people off, that's different. Well, certainly in English law, there's making someone redundant and there's sacking someone. And they are two different things. That's important. A lot of people don't realise that. Being made redundant, you did nothing wrong, you're still effective and all the rest of it and honest, but we can no longer afford to employ you because your department is being shut down or the whole business has gone bust. If you're sacked, it's for some gross breach of discipline, something like that. So some degree of job security. And unemployment benefits, if you're out of work, then you should get some sort of money. Sometimes if you've left voluntarily, you don't get it, but should there be something in some situations? And again, most people would accept that you should have that. Even the United States has a bit of that, and food stamps. Should there be accident insurance provided by the state if you meet an accident at work or not? Should there be any publicly funded health care, or should there be health and safety regulations at work? If you go back to the 19th century, in many cases there were none. You got injured at work, that was it. Even if your employer was grossly negligent, made no attempt to mitigate the chance of you coming to harm. And you could make you work in filthy, extremely noisy, hazardous conditions without providing any safety equipment or training. Should working hours be reasonable? An 8-hour day, a 10-hour day, a 12-hour day? To think of it, people were working like 16-hour days in factories long ago. Now, I know people in sedentary jobs work such long hours now, tend to be very well paid ones, so that's unusual. But any limitation on working hours, should we have that? And if there is a limit, what should it be? These are the kind of things I mean by workers' rights and social justice. Should you have any paid time off? Public holidays or days you choose to do whatever you want to do? How much should it be? The United States, with 10 days a year, is about the stingiest. France and Germany is about 40 days a year, about the most generous. Maternity leave, should there be that? Should it be paid paternity leave? Should there be a minimum wage? So should there be publicly funded schooling or indeed higher education? These are the issues of social justice. The governments do something to try and make sure people have a decent standard of living, have living wages. Now, some people have a living wage and that's it. Really is at subsistence level, could never afford any treats, any pleasures, very rarely buy a new item of clothing. As for eating out, forget it. A car, if at all, just a necessary, very simple one, and no pleasures at all. And in the United States, up to 50% of the population in that situation, as they couldn't afford $400 for an emergency expense kind of thing. So governments can pass legislation to regulate for this kind of thing, to provide this sort of thing. But what are the arguments against doing so? It seems to me that really there are only two. One of them, first of all, is cost and or the economy. It's too pricey and or it is having a deleterious effect in the economy. That's true. And the second argument is really interference. This is the overweening state poking its nose into private matters which are best left up to companies and employees, and they should sort it out for themselves. Now, there is some merit to both arguments. It just really depends how far you go with them. Are these things I've talked about, are they bad for the economy? I think they can be. Depends how high the wages are. Depends how difficult it is to sack somebody. If the very first day they become more or less unsackable, then they can be dreadful and you have to keep them. And it's long ago said by, I think, Alan Greenspan, who is chairman of the US Federal Reserve, if you want people to hire, you must let them fire. They won't take on extra staff if they then can't shed them if it goes wrong. So we don't want excessive job security because there'll be not enough jobs. And I realise unemployment benefits can be too high. People don't actually live in the lap of luxury on them, but they have little incentive to get a job, or they're doing the double, working in the black economy, illegally working whilst also claiming benefits. And accident insurance, obviously the pay shouldn't be too high, or people who injured themselves through their own fault are still able to claim off the state sometimes and claim exorbitant amounts, and the money's got to come from somewhere. It comes from Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer. Now, health and safety rules, they can be balmy and just excessive. Remember one school, they were saying you mustn't have the flagpole because that could collapse and kill someone, and the headmaster said, we're keeping it. And you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't boil a kettle, you can't stand on a chair. Obviously, it's daft. So it can go too far. And I realise that things like occupational hazards, you choose to do the job, then you are accepting the risk. You don't accept that, don't do the job. So I'm a bit more robust on this one and fairly libertarian on that issue. Working hours, should there be 8 hours? Should there be what? In France, down to 35 hours. Some people said that was dreadful because then you had to condense it into less. But I know other people say, well, just don't be a chair filler, just work every minute, honestly, fully concentrate. Don't be dawdling and just there, not really working. And some people felt the need to be at work a very long time just to appear like they were doing things. You must arrive before the boss. You can only go home after him, and to give the impression that you are diligent, when in fact you're just warming the chair. Maternity leave, I do agree with that, but not too extensive. If it's too lengthy, it's unfair on everybody else. You want to spawn, fine, produce your sprogs, but the rest of us shouldn't have to pick up the tab for you too much. All right, you have the joy of children, and that's a lifestyle choice, but it comes with certain repercussions. And paternity leave, I actually don't agree with. Some people do. If you want to share it, maternity, paternity, the father takes a bit, the mother takes a bit, all right. But I think the father should get additional leave, and some people think I'm wrong. Decent wages, well, what is decent? And I'll come on to Mr. Shapiro's counter-argument, saying, you say that you want $10 an hour, why not 20? Why not 50? Why not $100 an hour? Which really was absurd. So the thing is, Mr. Shapiro and so on, they think that wages, that they can be too high, and of course they can, but that they can't be too low. That's completely illogical. Yes, of course it would be uneconomic. This wouldn't be able to function. Society wouldn't be able to function. But in the US, the federal minimum wage is about $7.25. But $6, is that too little? $5, would that be too little? Is there nothing that's too little? It gets absurd. So there, Mr. Shapiro was pretending not to understand proportion. Now, as a lawyer, you would know what proportionality is, and things being too remote. There's this notion of reasonableness. Now, it's not easily determined, and different people have a different notion of what reasonable is. but there has to be some kind of consensus. There's got to be somewhere in the middle to still count as reasonable. There can be a range of reasonable, and there are things which are clearly outside of reasonable, and I can't delimit it clearly. And then, so these things can be too costly, I realise. It would be bad for the economy if they're too high, and it would be bad if they're too low. You look at Denmark, the most developed country in the world, the highest in the Human Development Index by most metrics in terms of longevity, terms of, well, happiness from measurements, suicide rate, the environment, crime, particularly murder, educational achievement. What else would you want? I suppose gender equality, their income, time off. I mean, the things that we would want, really. They don't have that many billionaires, but the average person's very well off, considering, and plenty of green space and on and on. And they have pretty high minimum wages, so and they have done since the 1930s. I had David Lloyd George making a speech about this. So I do believe in having a minimum wage, and I came from the opposite side. And minimum should be a minimum. It doesn't have to be particularly high. I know it'd be pretty tough to get by in the United Kingdom on the minimum wage there, but that's it. Get a higher paid job. Now, I know that's easier said than done. Not everyone's born talented or brainy, and so that's that. And should we do anything for disabled people? Should we provide for them? And I think that we should, but you might say that's too costly. And try and make it possible for them to work and have anti-discrimination legislation. And again, I know that can go too far, saying, ooh, we can't turn down so-and-so, even though he or she is not the most suitable, because we get sued for it, things like that. Obviously, we can't adjust a workplace when it's going to be incredibly expensive to do so, and not everyone can do every job. We just have to accept that. If you're severely physically disabled, you cannot be a soldier. That's that, I'm afraid. But I knew a barrister who was qualified. He couldn't get a pupillage. He claimed it was because he was in a wheelchair, which might have been true. I just don't know. We have to take into account these possibilities that people discriminate and try to prevent it. So, some of this social justice legislation can reduce costs, even if we have a more educated population. In the long run, or we pay people decently, there's less likely to be crime. We have publicly funded healthcare. We have fewer unwanted pregnancies, fewer abortions, and so on, or fewer neglected children because there was contraception in the first instance. And the other thing about things being too pricey is the same people who are often against doing anything about social justice support spending mind-blowing sums on the military and are ultra hawks. And the United States has this deregulated model, but US taxes are not that low. And actually, the US is quite regulated in the area of medicine, for example. That's what, and there's just so much going on in terms of tort. Suing each other is the national sport. So for some of the people like Mr. Crowder, Mr. Shapiro, maybe Ann Coulter and so on, it's almost as though exploitation's been taken out of the dictionary. Does it not exist? Now, you'd accept this in the case of sexual exploitation. There should be an age of consent. Should it be 18? Should it be 16? Japan, it's 20. Some US states, I believe, it's 14. But do you not accept that even if it was 14 in your state, that 13 would be too low, or 12, or something would be too low? That would be exploitation. Now, what's reasonable? We can't prove to a scientific standard that one level is right, that one age is right, or that one wage is right. But you accept there's got to be a minimum, even then. And I think some of the same principle applies. Eventually, it's exploitation. I know that word is thrown about too much. People often say exploitation, wage slavery, when it's not. But such things do exist. Just because the term is often misused doesn't mean that it's never used appositely. Anyway, the second major argument I was saying is interference. The state is overbearing and it shouldn't do that at all, to back off. And again, I have some sympathy for that argument, and I realise the state can overregulate and the legislation can be too burdensome. I don't want onerous legislation making it almost impossible to run a business or a school or anything like that. We have to change this building and that building and produce rooms and rooms of paperwork, and obviously it's a nightmare, so it can go too far. Obviously, you could go back to the 19th century model, freedom of contract model, whereas there was almost no regulatory burden, and it was a creative chaos, but people were severely injured, avoidably, and didn't get a penny in compensation. And a lot of people lived dreadful lives, and there was severe suffering. And that's why some paternalistic legislation was introduced. Suppose people say it's leading to totalitarianism. Although the thing is, totalitarians communist, Nazi, whoever, they don't care a fig about workers' rights. So that I don't think that's largely true. I did think sometimes in the UK we had health and safety totalitarianism. I thought we really needed a bonfire of regulations, a revolution in that area. And I do mean nothing short of revolution in terms of deregulation. I would go back to the 1980s. My general principle with regards to UK legislation was to repeal almost all the legislation passed since 1990. Well, there we are. I've examined some of the arguments against social justice, and as I pointed out, I certainly comprehend them, and I have some fellow feeling for these people who critique social justice and realize that occasionally it oversteps the mark. But where I disagree with them is they seem to believe that it doesn't exist at all, that it's a completely specialist thing. If you like my channel, please like me on Facebook, George from Ireland, and please donate to me on PayPal.